Hello, my name is Lark Baum. I am a social worker and I am an instructor in the Department of Behavioral Sciences here at the City College of San Francisco. Today I'm going to be speaking to you about systems of oppression, racial disparity, and community college achievement for African American students. I want to talk before I begin about the terms that I'm going to be using and the focus of today's presentation. I'm going to be using the term child welfare involved youth as opposed to foster youth because child welfare involved youth also encompasses those that are not currently in foster care or have never been in foster care. There are a number of ways to be involved in child welfare without ever having been placed in foster care, though many of the programs that are relevant to today's discussion do require that youth had been in foster care at some point and often on their 16th birthday to be enrolled. A lot of them don't. So I'm going to be using this larger and more broad term rather than foster youth. Also going to be using the term African American because that is the census designated term for this population. So the focus today is going to be on California and the Bay Area, in as much as it was possible to focus in closely on the Bay Area, because there are some unique issues and unique solutions employed in California to solve some of these problems that we're going to be discussing today. And our statistics are a little bit different than the nationwide statistics. So I want to not muddy the waters too much by trying to use national statistics for a basically local conversation. Also, we're going to be focused on African American families and youth because the disparities for this group are the most severe. Finally, community college bound and community college enrolled youth are also going to be the focus because that's what we do here at CCSF. So to begin, in every system that is not specifically designed to combat bias and oppression, racial disparity is clear to see from the statistics. These systems are a self-perpetuating cycle and interact in a way that makes it nearly impossible to overcome once initiated. So I think it's probably useful to talk about one example of a way that it might work. So you have an intact African-American family, let's say a heterosexual one, a man, a woman, a child living in a public housing arrangement because they're low income. So let's say that the man feels pushed to criminal behavior in order to support his family in the very high cost of living area of the San Francisco Bay. And he is convicted of a felony and incarcerated. So already we have the intersection of poverty and the criminal justice system. But we're about to add housing because in a lot of public housing systems, felonies are disqualifying for residents. So in a criminal justice system where there is a disproportionate number of African American men represented, presumably many of which have felonies, they're going to be disqualified from housing. So in our family, let's say that this man has been released, but he has no home to return to. And so he's in even more dire straits with regards to resources and everything that he was previously, and his family is as well. So now in this example, the family has also been separated, right? Because the felony has disqualified him from living with his family in the public housing. And so now we have financials that were already stretched and are now basically completely infeasible for mom and the child. And since dad has nowhere to go because of his felony, he is now experiencing homelessness. let's say that he leaves the area to find housing and work. So now he isn't in the picture at all. It's just mom trying to make ends meet and take care of the child. So mom is now pushed to make the same decision that dad originally did around finding illegal means to support her family. So now let's say that she's arrested too, not even necessarily, charged or convicted or anything. But the issue is women of any race are usually the primary and often the sole caretaker and provided for children, as is the case here. So when a woman enters the criminal justice system, what happens to her children is a relevant question. If there is no immediately available caretaker for a child, which there isn't in this case because dad was already forced out by the systems that the family lives in, then that child will enter the child welfare system whether or not they were abused or neglected, simply because there is no available caregiver. And so now we have a situation where poverty, housing, criminal justice, and child welfare have all intersected to really cause damage to a family, and an argument can be made to the systems around the family. You can also see from this example that the disproportionate numbers of African American people in the criminal justice system in turn contributes to a disproportionate number of African American children in the child welfare system. It's all interwoven. So now, to link racial disparity to more traditional ideas of child welfare involvement that we just illustrated. Though the example I just presented is a fairly common type of scenario, it doesn't really represent how most children and families enter the child welfare system. Most children and families enter the system through a report to the hotline. So first, there's a whole slew of risk factors that are associated with higher risk of becoming involved in the child welfare system. And it will come as no surprise that many of these are generally also associated with disproportionately high incidence in African American families, because again, the systems themselves are already set up in an oppressive way. Except now, we have to consider that many of those risk factors can cause behaviors or presentations in children that garner the attention of professionals like teachers. And teachers are by far the majority of reporters to the child abuse hotlines. Those teachers make reports. And here again, we see how the systemic factors sort of melt together with both implicit and explicit bias to create a disproportionate number of reports on African American families, which of course leads to a disproportionate level of involvement in the system. Also, it's important to note that once involved in the child welfare system, for any previous report, whether or not it was substantiated, families are very likely to return to the system again for another report. So now we've discussed two different ways that systemic oppression on multiple levels can coalesce and result in systemic oppression and disproportionate representation in child welfare. So these patterns and issues haven't gone unnoticed or unaddressed. One of the most important changes is the shift from policies being loose and interpretive and driven by anecdote and personal belief on the behalf of the workers and the supervisors and, kind of the on the ground staff who are doing the direct work with the families and the children, to a more systemic evidence base. It's not that there is not value to that lived experience of those workers. It's that there for a very long time in child welfare was very little systemic approach to issues. And so there was a very unlevel quality of response to families and to specific issues. So, 20 years ago, there were hardly any rigorous research studies done into methods and outcomes in child welfare. And now there is an ever widening field around developing that base specifically, both in an academic context, but also in a public policy context. There are a lot of really rigorous pieces of statistical research that are being completed by private entities, for profit or not for profit, in order to improve the system. So that's a fairly new phenomenon over the last 20 years or so, 20, 30 years. Additionally, there have been a number of legislative actions, lawsuits, and philosophical shifts that have made very real changes in how the system operates, both on a national level, but also for individual states. So in California, the KDA settlement addressed access and quality issues around mental health care for children in the child welfare system. And as with all settlements that come from lawsuits, it forced a change upon the system that was either not going to make it happen at all, or was going to happen at a much slower pace than it did. So lawsuits in child welfare, as in any large system, are often an extremely effective tool for rapid change in a system that is designed to change only very, very slowly. That is a feature of large government systems, not a bug. So sometimes when the system fails to adapt as quickly as it should to meet the changing needs of the population, or to address sort of newly acknowledged disparities, we end up in a situation where the response is not as strong as it should be. So again, though, the equity issues aren't disappearing. The improvements in child welfare are helping everybody involved in child welfare. So, these changes have improved services, have improved outcomes for everyone. However, they haven't made any real inroads into the equity issues. So while everybody is doing better, those African American child welfare involved youth are still not doing as well as other groups. So moving on to college, we have some basic issues that are across the board regardless of race. The two most strongly predictive factors for outcomes in college are highlighted here in red. They are poor academic outcomes stemming from trauma and systemic factors. So basically what we're talking about here is trauma causes all sorts of issues with focus, all sorts of issues with behavior, all sorts of problems that make it difficult to succeed in school. And then also we have the increased suspensions and exclusions specifically in the last year of high school. Those are the two most important factors that are predictive of how successful any student will be in moving on to college. But there are these other factors too. Frequent high school changes leading to a loss of credit and achievement is definitely a very important issue, and there are a number of legislative and policy interventions designed to prevent frequent changes, but there's not a lot of funding attached to helping students stay in their original schools. So it can be a bit of a challenge. And then high rates of absenteeism for any reason. So these things lead to basically, lagging academic achievement in high school and a much lower graduation rate than the general youth population. There's also this really high rate of summer melt before college for the child welfare involved youth. And basically, summer melt refers to um, a youth who has applied to college or is even enrolled in college, but somewhere in between, doing that work to kind of initiate contact with college and showing up to class on the first day, um, something happens and they never make it. So, I mean, this happens in all populations, but there is a much higher rate of summer melt in that child welfare involved youth cohort than in other cohorts. So, to address these issues, a number of legislative solutions have come to pass over the last 20 years, and before that as well. But that's what we're focusing on, and you know, they're all important and they're all really impactful because what happens is that all of these things have come together to increase access to financial and support services for first year community college students, all community college students, but that's the population we're talking about specifically today. And that's fantastic that access has been increased, but more is needed because um, even with these supports in place, the average for this population is 4 fewer credits earned and a GPA 0.33 lower for child welfare involved first year community college students compared to other students. That's quite a lot of credits and a big gap in GPA. So now, when you look specifically at the barriers that lead to those achievement gaps you saw on the last slide, they basically fall into two categories. Those that happen before the student reaches college and those around the college structure and experience itself. So some of these are addressed partially by those legislative and programmatic solutions, but as with any solution to most problems, they have gaps and areas for improvement. And I think most of these are pretty intuitive, but there's a few that I really want to highlight. And that I want to start with the suspicion and ambivalence around involvement in more systems. So often, by the time youth get to the age and the academic achievement level where they are headed towards college, they have been involved in the child welfare system and maybe the mental health system and maybe the housing system and maybe a bunch of other systems for a very long time. And there can be a pretty high level of suspicion and ambivalence around being involved in more systems, even though it's voluntary to become involved in these systems and they are designed to be helpful. These are youth that have grown up being told that all the systems are in place to help them, and they have not experienced them all as helpful. So this is a very strong factor for many of these youth. Um, and also, there is a very real, perhaps it is a intimidation factor around systems and processes for applications and procedures and deadlines. And many of these youth are not surrounded by adults who have been through these processes or completed these procedures, met these deadlines, and they're just not familiar with how this all works. So it can be very intimidating to try and figure all of that out. And a lot of these youth simply do not have enough support to complete the necessary work. Now, there are legislative solutions for this. Social workers are required to identify in adult in the case plan whose job it is specifically to help the youth complete these applications, meet these deadlines, all of that. However, in the real world, there is often a disconnect between that identified person and how it actually ends up happening um, in the in practice. So, with regards to barriers presenting themselves after college enrollment, um, most aid is dependent on a minimum course load that is not always possible. And I'm going to talk about that more in just a moment. But also, there are varying levels of supports from college to college. And the community college level, there is a certain legislatively required minimum level of support, but there are a number of programs that different colleges put into place to support this population of youth. And it's not always easy to compare what these supports are. And it's not always easy to understand from the websites, for example, what it is that is being offered at each college site. So, for example, next up is a program for this population that is offered at about 40 colleges statewide, but it's not offered at CCSF. Instead, we have something called the Guardian Scholars, which is a similar program, but not the same, and they do not have the same benefits. And so it can be difficult if you are trying to sort through what college you want to enroll in based on the support programs that are available to you, while you're also trying to, kind of figure out all the paperwork and the deadlines and all of that. It can be very difficult to figure out where you should go. Finally, data sharing across systems and within systems, what that refers to is a lot of these programs, well, all of the programs, rely on self-disclosure of the youth themselves in the process of enrolling, in the process of being involved in the program, that they are child welfare involved. And um, this is this is with good reason that it's designed in this way. It's designed in this way so that the youth have control over their own information, over their own data, and honestly, over their own trauma disclosure. However, um, there is an issue here around data sharing because these youth also have experienced a lot of changes and their information has not always followed them. So there's kind of two issues involved in that. And I also want to highlight this bracket along the left side here where it says Maslow's hierarchy. And this is probably the most important factor. So if you call back to the previous slide that was discussing the issues of summer melt, the issue of summer melt probably has a lot to do with trying to meet basic needs. And, that also comes back when we're talking about youth who are enrolled and actually attending the college. So what does that mean? What that means is um, when you are experiencing housing insecurity, food insecurity, financial insecurity, all of these are more basic needs that are going to have to come before college and before taking as many classes as is needed to maintain eligibility for support programs. So, in other words, if you are struggling to be housed, college is going to drop to a much lower tier on your list of priorities. And that's not to say that there are not a lot of unhoused students attending college. There are many unhoused students that attend college. It's that housing security and food security and financial security are going to appear on a more basic level than attendance at college. And many students are not going to be able to both address those needs and to also attend college. So here are some basic statistics on African American child welfare involved youth and their experiences in college. At this point, it should feel familiar to see the disparities laid out. And again, more work needs to be done to improve outcomes for all of these youth. But the racial disparities are especially troubling and really do need special attention. So the number on this slide that I want to draw your specific attention to is only 0.3% of child welfare involved African American students successfully earn 15 or more credits in their first term, compared to 2.7% of Asian students and 1.6% of white students. The aggregate data was not available for this statistic. That is a extremely low number. And given what we saw on previous slides about maintaining a certain minimum level of credits to maintain eligibility for the support programs, you can see that there's going to be a problem here. So it's important to remember that these disparities exist even within the child welfare involved youth population. So the takeaways from today, oppression persists and maintains racial disparities in multiple systems and most all systems that are not designed specifically to be anti-racist, right? That oppression and the systemic oppression persist. African American children become involved in child welfare at a disproportionate rate due to the systemic inequities. That is an issue that we see over and over again. Legislation, lawsuits, philosophical changes, and modifications to policies and procedures have improved child welfare outcomes for all, but have not addressed the racial inequities. Child welfare involved youth experience challenges in high school leading to academic problems, reduced graduation rates, and increased summer melt before fall college classes. Multiple programs seek to support child welfare involved youth in the college setting, which generally are accessed effectively, but regardless of the programs currently in place, more work is needed to address barriers for all child welfare involved students for whom there are significant persistent differences around GPA and credit attainment. Racial disparities in community college success for child welfare involved youth mirror those the youth experience outside of college. So basically, our youth are experiencing a microcosm of the systems that they have already experienced, again, when they come to college. It is incumbent upon us as educators to ensure that we are supporting these students to the best of our abilities. I want to thank you for joining me today. And if you have any questions or any feedback, I would welcome it. My contact information is on the first slide. Thank you very much for sticking with me.